Thank you. It is my honor to present this paper on behalf of my co-authors from Purdue and Oregon State University. We have Claudia and Margaret here in the room today. So I want to begin by saying good morning. And nothing wakes an audience up like some interactive question-answer sessions. I will take it easy on you. You don't have to stand up, but with a show of hands, you know, a lot of us in this room design and deploy systems out there that people use. How many of you believe that usability is important? Yay. How many of you actually do something about it? You know, usability inspection, heuristic evaluation, usability testing? Okay, all right, okay. How many of you believe that gender inclusiveness is important with these systems? Very good. How many of you do something about it? Now keep in mind, and I hope you got a chance to look around, that this audience, we're preaching to the choir, right? Because this audience self-selected to come to this conference and attend this session. But as you can see from the show of hands, there has been an awakening that has been happening over decades, very, very slowly, but the sun is still not done rising. So good morning. Well, so if you're interested in identifying gender biases and gender inclusiveness issues on the systems you develop, one method for doing so is GenderMag, which was developed by Margaret Burnett at Oregon State. GenderMag is a usability inspection method in the cognitive walkthrough family, and you can use it to identify cognitive biases on user interfaces. GenderMag rests on these 5 cognitive facets, and the values on these 5 cognitive facets have been shown again and again to cluster around the 2 genders that we have data about. And in this presentation, we're going to refer to these clusters as the Abby values on these 5 cognitive facets versus the Tim values on these 5 cognitive facets. Abby and Tim are the names of my cats. No, just kidding. Abby and Tim are 2 of the 3 personas that GenderMag offers in their toolkit that you could download from the website if you're interested to run a GenderMag analysis. Okay, so with GenderMag, you take these multi-personas. The personas have fixed values on these cognitive facets, but then you can customize their goals and interests to suit your project. And then you walk through the system from the point of view of each persona. And as a result, you identify interface issues that might not support some values on some cognitive facets. So you know that those are problems, those are usability issues or gender inclusiveness issues, and you know you should fix them. Maybe you even go forth and fix them. But what happens then? Does usability actually improve? For whom? Is it possible that if you fix an issue that does not support, let's say, the risk aversion value of the facet, you're actually hurting the other side, you're hurting Tim? So is it possible that if you use GenderMag, perhaps you don't improve inclusiveness? All right? Or maybe you do. So it's with these kinds of questions in mind that we set out to perform this study, which is basically an investigation into GenderMag's effectiveness. Right? We wanted to collect evidence to see how useful and accurate and what are the effects of doing a GenderMag redesign. And we did that using a 3-step investigation. I'm going to quickly walk you through each step. So in the first step, we conducted a GenderMag analysis in the context of Microsoft Academic. Microsoft Academic is a semantic search service for scholarly publications. It is a project out of Microsoft Research, and at the time of the study, I was engaged in a complete redesign of its interface. So 2 of our co-authors conducted GenderMag analysis using the toolkit downloaded from the website. So we used the Abby and the Tim personas, and they customized them to suit the purposes of academic search, developed scenarios with some of the tasks that people would want to accomplish that would be possible on Microsoft Academic, and then walked through these scenarios broken down into sub-goals and actions, which are specific steps a user could take to accomplish those scenarios. And while doing so, they marked any problems with the interface, and they marked which value of which facet might not be supported, and wrote some comments explaining why, as you could see highlighted in orange over there. So as a result of the GenderMag analysis, the two co-authors identified 10 issues of gender inclusiveness on the interface. In the second step, we performed a facet-driven redesign. And so this is different from a regular redesign, and I'll explain how with this particular example from filters. On the search engine results page, Microsoft Academic has a long list of filters on the left side, and each filter in the original design had 10 options. Okay? Now, for the Tim persona, whose learning style is more tinkering rather than process-oriented and detailed and reading everything, we encountered the risk that he would not read through the entire list of filters because it was so long, and he would not even notice that there's a top institution filter somewhere down the page. For the Abby persona, and particularly her values on the motivations and risk facets, Abby is task-oriented, doesn't have time to mess around and tinker and play around with technology if she doesn't know what the result is going to be. She also tends to be more risk-averse. So we had the publication numbers shown on the filters. The filters didn't look a lot like filters, right? They look more like a bar chart. So for Abby, we looked at this facet and we redesigned by removing the numbers to do our best to make the filter more look like a filter. And for Tim, we redesigned by shortening the list, the number of items on the list. And so this shows you how the facets that we paid attention to helped us lead our thinking about the redesign. In the third step, we conducted Wizard of Oz comparative usability testing using a high-fidelity paper prototype. We had a between-subject design with the original versus the post-GenderMag redesign versions of the paper prototype. And what we actually counted are action failures, okay? So again, this is something like task performance, but there can be several action failures, several steps towards accomplishing a task. So that's a bit more granular measure. Our participants were recruited using criterion sampling. Of course, they had to be users of scholarly search engines, but not familiar with Microsoft Academic. And we also looked for diversity in terms of cognitive facets and gender. So I want to draw your attention to the facet distributions, which they self-assessed using a questionnaire that had been used previously in research. And we can see that only 3 of our participants are pure Abby's or Tim's. They scored on the Abby, 1 participant scored on all 5 facets on the Abby side, and 2 participants scored on the Tim side on all the 5 facets. 1 of them was a woman. So basically what this tells us is gender is complicated and cognitively complicated, and we see that the other 17 participants had a combination of Abby and Tim-like values on the 5 cognitive facets. So this is important to keep in mind because we did not conduct the analysis by gender. We actually compared facet by facet. And so I want to show you our facet distribution in the original versus post-GenderMag redesign was just about even for most facets. Okay, so let's dive into the results. So we have 2 main questions here, and the first one is going to be about usability. Does GenderMag improve usability? So if we look at the number of action failures, we see that in the redesign, the number of action failures dropped by more than half, which means that, yes, overall usability improved. But for whom? So the next question addresses inclusiveness, and I'm going to walk you through how to read this table that tells the entire story. So for example, for the first two issues, if we look at the first row, we see that we identified an issue attributed to the Abby value of the motivations facet, and we redesigned for it. And in the usability effects, we helped usability for Abby, but also for Tim as a nice side effect. Another example, same issues, for the learning facet, we identified issues and redesigned for both Abby and Tim, and we ended up helping both Abby and Tim. So the question is, did we hurt anyone? Well, there are only two instances where that happened. In an instance where we redesigned for Abby, we helped Abby, but we ended up hurting Tim. And another instance where we redesigned for Abby, and our redesign ended up hurting Abby, but helping Tim. Okay? However, if you look overall, you see that the redesign did not hurt the other side of the facet. It either kept things the same, or more often than not, it actually improved usability for both sides of the facet. Okay, so let's take an in-depth look to see how we got here and how these results came about. Now, in the paper, we tell the story of all the issues that we identified. We talk about the facets that were involved and the rationale. We describe the redesign, and we show before and after pictures, as well as detailed results from the usability testing. So here we're just going to look at the results of the usability test for one of the issues, and this one we're going to read it by column to show you how we did the facet by facet comparison. So for issue 4, we see that in the original condition, 6 participants experienced action failures. If we look at the motivations facet, we see that of those 6 participants, 4 had Abby-like values on this facet, 2 had Tim-like values. Now let's look at the same facet in the redesign, and what we're learning here is that we helped Abby. There were no action failures with the Abby-like, but Tim remained the same. If we look at another facet, information processing, same story, same for the original. However, in the redesign, we actually helped both Abby and Tim. Okay? So now, off to the next question, is GenderMag accurate? So when we think about accuracy, one of the questions that we ask, does it actually identify issues accurately? So if the analysts say, this is going to be an issue that needs to be fixed, do the participants in the usability test actually experience that issue? So in our case, 100% of the issues that the analysts identified actually happened to the participants. All right. Now, this is consistent with previous data for GenderMag and cognitive walkthroughs that showed that they're pretty good in terms of true positives. Rates are usually 96% and above. But there's also the question of missing issues. Were there any issues that the participants encountered that the analysts didn't point out? Now, if we look at the previous studies, we see that that happens 30 to 70% of the cases with cognitive walkthroughs. In our case, there was at least one instance, one blatant instance where this happened, and we tell the story of that in the paper. Another thing to note is that the analysts, they were graduate students in HCI, but they were not GenderMag experts. This was their first time conducting a GenderMag analysis, and in spite of that, their accuracy rate was very high. Another question that we ask in terms of accuracy is, does it identify facet biases accurately? So if an analyst says, we believe this is going to be an issue for the Abby side of the motivations facet, do people who score on the Abby side of the motivations facet actually encounter that issue? In our study, this was indeed the case, and 75%, that's 15 of the 20 facets that were identified by the analysts. So once again, that's a pretty good rate. Okay, so we've seen the results and the yeses over here. One question that we still haven't addressed is, well, how about gender? Because all these analyses were done by facet. What happens with gender? So let's look at our participants again. Just like in the other studies, we see that women skewed towards Abby values on the facets and men towards Tim values. So then if we do the analysis by gender, we see that in the original condition, women experienced twice as many action failures as men. However, in the redesign, not only did action failures reduce, but the playing field was leveled. This is where I was supposed to do the mic drop, but I'm not allowed. So I want to briefly touch on implications for design. Is GenderMag effective? Okay. Another lesson that we're learning is about the facet-driven redesign, using the GenderMag facets to inspire our redesigns. The next story is that it is, but it is not about gender, and this is a story that we've heard from pluralism in feminist HCI. And finally, I want to leave you with the thought that cognitive diversity is gender diversity, and so if you support cognitive diversity, you're going to support gender diversity as well.
Thank you. Do we have any questions? Jessica.
Hello. You said at the beginning there were 3 personas. So the Abby and Tim. What's the third persona like in that case?
So the third persona is a combination of the 5 facet has some Abby values and some Tim values. But we used for clarity and simplicity the ends of the spectrum, the Abby and Tim. And the middle persona is actually their Patrick or Patricia. But we opted for to keep things clearer for the other 2.
Other questions?
I think there's one. Oh, or not.
Okay, while we're waiting to get the mic, I have a quick question, which I'm dying to ask, because I think this is, I've read a bunch of GenderMag papers. This is really important work. But as we know from intersectionalist and queer theory, we aren't just Abbies and Tims. We have a whole range of nuanced, often trans and genderqueer identities. And I know that you guys have engaged with that elsewhere, but you haven't had a chance to in your talk. So could you explain how you could use GenderMag and be inclusive to LGBTQIA gender identities?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this question. And one thing that we struggled with, a lot of these cognitive facet measures, they're only reported for 2 genders. But if you look at how we analyze the data and how we looked at each individual, right? One individual can have a combination of values, right? So they could be 3 Tim, 1 Abby, or 4 Abby, 1 Tim. And this is not necessarily related to the gender that they report, right? Because we have one person with all 5 Tim values who identified as a woman, okay? And so in this sense, and this is why we wanted to do the analysis by facet rather by gender, we only had 2 genders represented, right? And we didn't ask about sexual orientation in our study, but we believe that if you look at the individual and the individual's combination of facet values, this is how you can begin to address that. But of course, it would be really, really interesting to extend the research on these values and see how, the variety of people and genders might score, or even just keep in mind that each individual can be a combination.
That was a fantastic answer to a really mean question. Next question.
I have a similar question in the sense that thinking about values in gender, there's a lot of intersectional issues in terms of race, ethnicity, nationality, things like that. Is that considered at all in these sort of evaluations?
So I don't know that I can or should answer in general for these sorts of evaluations, because I'm not really sure what sorts of evaluations you're referring to, or whether you're referring at the previous literature that informs GenderMag. I can only tell you that in our present study, I described the participants, and these are the participants that we worked with. But I'd be happy to talk to you more about previous research and literature, and of course, Margaret over here would be happy to answer that question for you afterwards.
Thank you very much. We're going to have to go to our next speaker.